Let's now copy our .env.example file. And what we are going to do is rename it to just .env. So we have that .example, which can be pushed to the Git repository if you decide to keep it basically within the repository, which doesn't have any sensitive information in. They are just variables with some default values. And .env is the one that's actually going to be kept on your machine, or when you install in the project, when you publish in the project on the server, you will need this file as well. Now, if you open .gitignore, you'll see that .env is not going to be pushed with your commit to the repository. That's why I'm keeping this gitignore because I will be pushing all these changes to the repository eventually. If you are not working with the Git, then don't worry about this. You don't have to have this .env.example, but you will have to have this .env because this is where our credentials for the database, our credentials for the SMTP will come from, and so on. So first of all, what I'm going to do is to set up my database variables. I'm going to be using MySQL database, and then for the host is 127.0.0.1, which is the equivalent of localhost. So you can either use this IP or just type localhost. Now for the database, I've created database login. If I open SQL Pro, I'm using SQL Pro here with Homestead. If you're using WAMP, MAMP or XAMPP, you probably have access to either SQL Pro if you're on a Mac or phpMyAdmin. Please create a new database and obviously have some credentials ready to obviously specify here within your config file as well in order to be able to access this database. So for the database name, we're going to have login. For username, because I'm using Homestead, it's going to be Homestead. And then secret for the password. I'm going to leave these credentials for SMTP off. I will fill them in behind the scenes, but please make sure that you have some SMTP credentials so you can actually, again, associate these values with the variables here. Now, for the business name, I'm going to put in between a single or double quotes SSD space tutorials. If you don't have spaces, you can ignore this single or double quotes on both sides, but if there is a space, make sure that you wrap them within either single or double quotes. Now for the business email, I'm going to use info@ssdtutorials.com, and this both of these variables will later on be used when we go into send emails such as, for instance, registration activation or reset password email. So these two will be used and displayed within the from field of the email sent to the recipient. Okay, environment app env is local because we're working on the project. Later on when it's published, you can change it to live. Session driver, we're going to be using file by default, then session path. This is where I want to store my sessions, which was going to be the storage and session directory. Then cookie driver file as well. Both of these will be overwritten if we open PHP unit. When we're going to be testing, as you can see, session driver is set to array and cookie driver is also set to array. And then mail driver is set to test, because when we're testing, we don't actually want to use the actual file system, in our case for session or cookie. We also don't want to actually distribute email using this service provider in the SMTP. We just want to test it in a sense that it's going to fake that it did the distribution. That's why we're using the test. And we'll look at this later on as well when we're actually creating this component. And now for the database connection, when we're going to be testing, we'll use SQLite rather than MySQL. And database itself will be memory, which allows us to basically, rather than using the file again, database file, to run all these queries in memory. In other words, we're not going to be actually interacting with the database file itself. So that's for the PHP unit. And then we have verification true. Verification, as you saw in the introduction video, this is the variable that will specify what sort of behavior for the registration form we want to set. If it's set to true, it will send the activation email, and account will be inactive until this link within the activation email is clicked, at which point we'll change the status of the account from active false to active true. If we set this to false, then registration will not require activation, and after the registration, user will automatically be logged into the system. So you will be able to easily change it later on here, whichever way you're gonna prefer. You can change it at any time, so you can have a system running with the activation. Then at some point you say, okay, I don't want to use the activation anymore, and you just change this variable, and that's all, and it's going to work straight away. Okay, so this is our .env file now ready. As I said, I will fill this mail starting mail underscore variables later on behind the scenes, because I don't want to reveal any credentials, my SMTP credentials. You make sure that obviously you fill these variables yourself as well. Okay, so that's the .env file. Next thing we're going to do, if you open our composer.json, you'll see that for the autoload, PSR4 is the way we're going to be autoloading our files. We're using app namespace, and this app points to the app directory. So let's create this directory, and this is the directory where all our files classes will be located. So app, and this is all our utilities, our models and everything will be there. So that's the first thing we need to do. Then tests, we need the test directory as well. So directory tests, and I think that's everything for now, so we can close the composer. The next thing we're going to do is to create the Bootstrap directory Bootstrap. And if we open our public directory, and then if we open index.php, right after the opening PHP tag, what we're going to do is require once, and the file we want to require, rather than requiring the autoloader that's actually within the vendor directory, first of all, we are going to actually require the file going up one level, and then to the Bootstrap directory. And within this Bootstrap directory, we're going to create a separate autoloader, so autoload.php. We don't have this file, so let's quickly create it within this new directory. So PHP file autoload.php. And within this file, what I'm going to do, first of all, is to require this autoloader from within the vendor. So basically, rather than inside of the index requiring this Bootstrap autoload and then vendor autoload, we only require this Bootstrap, and Bootstrap will take care of making sure that we have this vendor autoload available as well. So require once as well. We're going to use the brackets here, and we use real path function, which will take path to the current directory, and obviously that points to this Bootstrap directory. Now we need to get out one level, point to the vendor, and to the this autoload.php file. So what I'm going to do is concatenate it in between a double quote, starting with the /, then two full stops, /, then vendor, and then after this autoload.php. And this real path will make sure that the full path is the absolute path to this file is correct. It's basically taking this full stops as going out from this current directory, then vendor directory, and file autoload.php. So now we have our autoload file available. The next thing we want to do is to instantiate .env. So .env variable equals, and we start new .env, and this one will take path to our environment file, this one which we've just been playing with a moment ago. So real path again, and we're going to do the same directory, concatenate it with, we're going to go out one level, and then after this file name .env. So that's now the constructor for this .env has now loaded this file. The next thing we need to do is to use .env and call method overload. Overload will basically overwrite any variables that are specified within this file that may have already been defined. So if there's any variable, environment variable that already exists, then it's going to be overwritten with what we have in this .env file. Next thing, .env, we need to specify some requirements, so required, and that's taking the array, and we're telling that for this system to work correctly, we need the following variables. And I'm going to split the screen here so I can copy them. DB connection is what I need for sure. The next one I need for sure is a session driver as well. So these are required. If one of them won't be available, then this required method will throw an exception, and obviously system won't run. And next thing we're going to need is database host as well. We could put them all, but I'm just going to put a few most important ones. Database, username and password. And I think that's going to be enough. And then DB password. Okay, so that's all. Now I'm going to close this .env file because we don't need it anymore here. I'm going to import this .env. Now the next thing I need is to start the session, but we obviously don't have the session component yet. So inside of the app directory, I'm going to create a new one called utilities. And inside of this utilities, another directory called session. And within this directory, I'm going to start with the file PHP class called session manager. And the namespace for this one will be, as you may remember, app directory has app namespace associated with it. Then we have utilities and session. So it's going to be app /utilities, then /session. And what this class will implement is a magic method called call static. This method will allow us to delegate all static method calls to the classes that we're going to be using as session drivers. In our case, it's going to be either file or array session. So let's create this call static method. There we go. So that's the structure of this method. Public static function 2_call static. It takes name and argument as 2 arguments to this method. And then we're going to start with the session variable. And this one will simply call another method within the same class. So static, it's going to be static because obviously we are calling it from within a static method, and from within a static method, so you cannot use pseudo variable this to refer to non-static methods. So it needs to be a static method if we want to refer to any method within the same class. Then class name. We don't have this method yet, so let's quickly create it. And what this method will return is basically the name of the class representing the given session based on a session driver that we specified inside of this .env file. As you can see here, session driver, by default it's file, but when we're going to be testing, session driver will be set to array. So we need 2 implementations, one for the array and one for the file. Let's quickly first of all create this name of the class. So driver, I'm going to start with equals and then .env package. It has this get method which allows us to get the value associated with the given variable, environment variable. So I'm going to use the session driver here. And a second argument that we can pass to this method is the default value. If this variable, this environment variable, doesn't have any value associated with it, that's what I want to return. And by default, I'm going to set it to file. So now we have a name. Now return, we're going to use magic constant namespace, which basically points to the namespace of the class from within you. Call this constant. Then we concatenate it in between a double quotes, 2 backslashes. One will escape the closing double quote, and the other is to actually have a backslash representing the obviously separator within the namespace. And then UC first function, which will convert the first letter of this driver into capital letter. So we pass driver as argument and then concatenate it with the session. So the name of any of these drivers will be, for instance, for file, it's going to be file session. For array, it's going to be array session. That's how this file is going to be called. Okay, so our class name now returns what we want. Let's quickly add the doc blocks. It returns string, and what it actually does, it get qualifying class name or session driver class name. Session driver class name. Okay, let's add doc blocks to call static as well. It will delegate call to a method of the chosen session class. I think that makes perfect sense, apart from the fact that I obviously misspell it again. Okay, so and it will return what will it return? It will return mix because we don't really know what it's going to return. We can call any of the methods. Some of them return something. They may return string, integer, float. They may return void. In other words, they don't return anything. So that's why we specify this as mixed. Okay, and the next thing that we have the fully qualifying name, including the namespace, to the file that's going to be used as our session driver. We simply return, and we use the function call user func array, and the callable is going to be new session, which is basically going to be whatever class that's going to return, class name that's going to return. So instantiating it and then calling the method, which is represented by the first argument of this call static method. So method on this session driver, and then any potential arguments that could be passed through as the second argument to this call user func array. And if you're not familiar with this function, please visit php.net, paste the name in the search bar, and it's going to basically give you the specification for it. Okay, so I think our session manager is now completed. I'm just going to clean up these spaces here a little bit, and that's it. I think we can save and close the file. And in the next video, we're actually going to create a contract and then two implementations, one file session and the other one called array session.